Welcome to Karen Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to never miss a crazy story. Let's dive in.
I was covered in sweat, my hands caked with dirt, and my mind laser-focused on getting the last few rows of seeds planted before the sun reached its peak. Farming wasn't just my job, it was my legacy. My family had owned this land for generations, and I wasn't about to let anything interfere with that. Then, my phone buzzed. Again, I ignored it at first. There was nothing more important than getting these seeds into the ground before the season changed. But after the fifth call, I finally caved and checked my messages. 10 missed calls from neighbors, 3 voicemails from my cousin, and then an email from the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The subject line? Violation notice. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened the email. Your continued activities are in direct violation of Oak Ridge Estates community standards. The noise pollution from your farming equipment is disruptive, and the odor from your livestock negatively impacts property values. You are hereby ordered to cease all farming operations within 500 feet of the community property line within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in fines of $200 per day. I blinked, then read it again. They were serious. My farm had been here for over 100 years. The Oak Ridge Estates development? It had only been around for 8 months. And yet, somehow, they thought they had the authority to dictate what I did on my own land. I tossed my phone back into my truck and got back to work. HOA or not, no one was going to stop me from running my farm. The next morning, just as I was getting ready to head out, I heard the sharp slam of a car door. I stepped onto my porch to see a woman in a crisp, white pantsuit marching across my front yard. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her perfectly sculpted nose, she looked every bit the nightmare I had been expecting. Behind her trailed 2 men, both wearing polo shirts, embroidered with the Oak Ridge Estates logo. "Mr. Jackson," the woman called, her voice sugar-coated but firm. "I'm Karen Wilson, president of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. We need to discuss your continued violations." I crossed my arms, leaning against the porch railing. "There's nothing to discuss. Your HOA has no jurisdiction over my property." Karen's smile didn't even falter. She flipped open her clipboard and adjusted her sunglasses. "Actually, according to the county zoning board, your agricultural exemption expired last year. That means your property is now subject to our community standards, as outlined in Municipal Code Section 42.3. That caught me off guard. My property taxes certainly hadn't changed. If my exemption had expired, I would have known about it. "My family has farmed this land for over 100 years, I said slowly. "No HOA can just claim authority over it." Karen's smile turned cold. "Times change, Mr. Jackson. Our residents paid premium prices for homes with guaranteed property values. We can't have disruptive, outdated activities interfering with that." She handed me another notice, this one marked "Cease and Desist" in bold red letters. I laughed, out loud. This woman actually thought she could walk onto my land and order me to stop farming? I crumpled the paper and tossed it back at her. "You have no legal right to tell me what to do with my land. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." The 2 men behind her shifted uncomfortably. Karen, however, didn't move an inch. "I suggest you reconsider, Mr. Jackson," she said smoothly. "We have a team of attorneys well-versed in property disputes. Ignoring this will only make things worse for you. Lady, you're on my property, and you're trespassing. So if you don't want me to call the sheriff, I'd suggest you get back in your little HOA mobile and drive right back where you came from." Karen's lips pursed. She clearly wasn't used to people pushing back. "We'll be in touch," she said finally, turning on her heel and marching back to her SUV. I watched as she drove off, the 2 men scrambling to follow her. But something told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, my cousin Tom called. "They've been planning this for months," he said. "Something weird is going on. Karen's been having private meetings with developers, and she's been changing HOA meeting minutes after they're approved." My stomach turned. I spent the next few hours digging through county records online, and sure enough, my agricultural exemption was still valid for another 5 years. Karen had lied straight to my face. The next morning, I woke up to find 3 noise complaints had been filed against me. The sheriff, an old high school buddy of mine, showed up at my door, looking apologetic. "Look, Mike," Sheriff Davis sighed. "I know this is ridiculous, but they're filing complaints every single day. They've even started a petition to label your farm a public nuisance. I clenched my fists. What the hell is really going on here, Dave? The sheriff glanced around before lowering his voice. There was a closed-door meeting last week. County commissioners, a big-time developer from the city, and the HOA board. They're pushing for some big project. That afternoon, I spotted strangers in suits walking my eastern fields, taking pictures and making measurements. I drove my truck straight over to them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" I said, my voice tight. "You're trespassing on private property." A tall man in an expensive suit extended his hand. "James Miller, Westview Development Corporation. Just surveying the land for preliminary planning." I narrowed my eyes. "Planning for what exactly?" "This is my farm." Miller frowned and consulted his tablet. "According to our paperwork, Westview purchased 1,700 acres from Oak Ridge Estates HOA 3 weeks ago. Construction begins next month." My heart nearly stopped. "That's impossible," I said, my voice hoarse. "I never sold my land to anyone." Miller showed me the digital documents on his screen. There it was. Official county stamps, survey maps, and my land, sold, by the Oak Ridge Estates Community Trust. I felt my blood run cold. This wasn't just a zoning dispute anymore. They had stolen my land. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my truck kicking up dust as I tore down the county road toward the recorder's office. My land, my damn land, sold without my consent. Stolen right out from under me by a bunch of smug suburbanites who thought their cookie-cutter houses gave them the right to dictate what happened on land my family had owned for generations. I barely remembered parking. I stormed into the county records office, my boots hitting the tile with an angry thud. The clerk, Miss S. Rivera, had known my family since I was a kid. She glanced up from her desk, her eyes widening. "Mike, what's wrong? I need you to pull the current deed records on my farm." My voice was strained, tight, like a rope about to snap. She frowned but tapped on her keyboard, fingers moving fast. The seconds stretched into eternity before she turned the screen toward me. The words on the document blurred for a moment as a red haze clouded my vision. Owner, Oak Ridge Estates Community Trust. Recorded transfer date, 6 weeks ago. Retained by prior owner. 300 acres main house and surrounding property. I forced myself to breathe. This is wrong. I never signed anything. That land is mine. Miss S. Rivera chewed her lip. "Mike, I remember processing this, but something did feel off. I even meant to call you, but the paperwork was notarized, and the county stamp was there. Send me everything," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. Minutes later, I was in my truck, my phone open to my email. The copies of the deed transfer sat there, mocking me. I stared at the signature, my name, in ink, but I had never signed that document in my life. Fraud. I was out of my truck before I even realized I had driven back home. I stormed into my house, threw open the safe where I kept my original land deeds, and spread them across my kitchen table. Every boundary, every notarized mark, every signature, all proof that the land belonged to me. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer, Sam Grayson. "Mike?" His voice was groggy. "You know what time it is?" "I don't give a damn what time it is," I snapped. "HOA forged documents and sold my land out from under me. Get to my house, now." Silence, then the sound of shuffling. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. Sam arrived, looking like he hadn't even had time to finish his coffee. His tie was loose, and his hair was a mess, but his expression sharpened the moment he saw the documents spread out in front of him. He flipped through them, his frown deepening with every page. "This is the most brazen land grab I've seen in 30 years of practice." He looked up at me. "They covered their tracks well, but they slipped up." "How?" I demanded. He tapped the forged deed transfer. "Your signature is identical to the one on your original deed from decades ago. 2 identical. No natural variations. That means someone copied it directly, probably digitally. If we can prove that, we can prove fraud." A sliver of relief cracked through my fury. "So we can stop them?" Sam sighed. "Legally? Yes. But undoing the sale will take time. And the developers, Westview, are innocent parties in this, legally speaking. They bought the land believing it was legitimate. They might fight to keep it." I clenched my jaw so hard it ached. "I don't have time. They start construction in 4 weeks. Sam ran a hand through his hair. Then we need to make their lives hell in the meantime. That night, as I stared out at my darkened fields, the sound of cicadas thick in the air, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Headlights. On my land. I grabbed my shotgun and stormed outside. As I got closer, I could see them, surveyors, in my goddamn fields. Again, I approached, my boots crushing dry grass underfoot. "You boys lost?" A man in a neon vest looked up from his clipboard. No, sir. Just finishing up some late-night site marking." "This isn't a site," I growled. "This is my farm, and you're trespassing." The man frowned and pulled out his phone. "I have orders from Oak Ridge Estates HOA and Westview Development. They own this parcel now." "Do they?" I snatched the phone from his hand, flipped through the emails. Karen Wilson's smug name stared back at me. That was the last straw. I stepped up onto the hood of their truck and held my shotgun high. "Listen up," I called, loud enough that they'd have to hear me over their own stupidity. "You're on my land. This isn't HOA property. This isn't Westview's property. This is my farm. If I catch one more soul out here without my say-so, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." The surveyors scrambled, throwing their gear into the truck before peeling off down my dirt road. The next morning I had a visitor, Karen. She arrived in her luxury SUV, stepping out in another crisp pantsuit, phone in hand, looking like she had just won a war. She smirked. "Mr. Jackson, threats of violence will not be tolerated." I stepped onto my porch, arms crossed. "You forged my signature. You stole my land." Karen sighed dramatically. "That's a bold accusation. The sale was completely legal." I pulled my phone from my pocket. "Then why is the county opening a fraud investigation?" Her smirk flickered, just for a second, but I saw it. I took a step closer. "I have the original deeds. I have a lawyer. I have a fraud case. And you? You have nothing?" Karen's confidence wavered before she forced another plastic smile. "This will be tied up in court for years, Mr. Jackson." The first tilted my head. "Oh, I'm sure it will. But tell me, Karen, how do you think your residents will feel when I shut off their water?" Her expression finally cracked. I grinned, slow and dangerous. "You should have done your homework. That HOA you love so much, it depends on a reservoir that sits on my remaining land, and under the original agreement, agricultural use gets first priority." Karen's face paled. I leaned in. "If you think this fight's over, sweetheart, you haven't even seen the opening round." Karen's smug expression had vanished, replaced by something I hadn't seen before, uncertainty, maybe even fear. It was subtle, but I caught it. For the first time in this ridiculous war she had started, she realized she wasn't untouchable. I let the silence stretch, watching as the weight of my words sank in. "You can't be serious," she scoffed, but her voice lacked the same arrogant certainty from before. "You wouldn't actually cut off the water supply to an entire community. That would be perfectly legal," I cut in. "My family's had first rights to that reservoir for generations. Your precious development only exists because my grandfather agreed to share. And that deal? It specifically states that agricultural use takes priority." I took another step forward, lowering my voice just enough to make her lean in. "Which means if I decide I suddenly need every last drop for my crops, there's not a damn thing you can do about it." Her jaw tightened, and I could see her scrambling for an angle, a counterattack. Karen wasn't used to being outmaneuvered. "This is extortion," she hissed. "You'd be punishing innocent families' children for a personal vendetta. The court will eat you alive." I laughed. Actually laughed. "You stole my land, Karen, forged my signature, sent surveyors onto my property without permission. And now you're upset that I'm using my own legal rights to fight back? Funny how that works." She adjusted her blazer, regaining some of that self-righteousness. "The community will hear about this. And when they do, they'll know exactly what kind of man you are." "Oh, they'll hear about it," I agreed. "In fact, I think I'll tell them myself." Before she could respond, I turned, walked into my house, and grabbed my phone. Within minutes I had fired off an email to the local news station, the county water authority, and, for good measure, a few local business owners who depended on my farm's produce. Then, I made a few calls. If Karen wanted a fight in the court of public opinion, I'd be happy to give her one. By the time I arrived at town hall later that afternoon, the place was packed. Word had spread fast. HOA members, residents, farmers, even a couple of city officials. I'd never seen such a mix of people in one place. Some looked confused, some angry, but most just looked worried. And then there was Karen, standing near the front like she was preparing to deliver some grand sermon. "Ah, Mr. Jackson," she called, voice dripping with forced politeness. "So good of you to join us." I ignored her and stepped up to the microphone. "I'll keep this short," I said, scanning the room. "As most of you know, my family has farmed this land for over a century, and up until about 6 weeks ago, that included 1,700 acres that were stolen out from under me through forged documents and shady deals." Murmurs spread through the crowd, people glancing at one another. A few residents looked at Karen, clearly expecting her to deny it. She didn't, so I kept going. "Now, I've got a legal battle ahead of me, and I'll fight that in court. But here's something you all need to understand. Oak Ridge Estates relies entirely on a reservoir that sits on my remaining 300 acres. And per the original agreement, I have first rights to that water." The murmurs turned to shouts. "You can't just cut us off. What the hell are we supposed to do? My kids need that water." I held up a hand, silencing them. "I don't want to cut you off. I've never had a problem sharing. But you should all ask your beloved HOA president why she thought it was a good idea to steal farmland from the guy who literally controls your water supply." All eyes swung to Karen. She stiffened. "This is an outrageous attempt to blackmail the HOA into dropping its perfectly legal land acquisition. We followed all proper channels." "You forged my signature, Karen," the first snapped. "Don't stand there and pretend you did this by the book. You lied. You manipulated people. And now you're going to answer for it." Silence. Karen's face was an unreadable mask, but the crowd, they weren't buying it anymore. I wasn't done. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. If the HOA doesn't immediately rescind its fraudulent claim over my property, I'll be filing for a full shut-off of non-agricultural water usage until this matter is settled. That means no water for homes, no water for lawns, no water for your fancy fountains." I leaned forward. "You want to live in a neighborhood without basic utilities? Because that's what Karen here is about to give you." Karen turned a deep shade of red, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But it was too late. The room erupted. "You did what? Karen, tell me this isn't true. We paid you to protect our property values, not destroy them." Panic flickered across her face. "Everyone, please resign," someone shouted. "Yeah, resign." Karen's eyes widened as the chant picked up momentum. Even her own board members were looking at her with suspicion now. She raised her hands like a preacher, calming a riot. "Let's not be hasty." I turned to leave. "Oh, and Karen, one more thing." She glared at me. "What?" I pulled my phone from my pocket and hit play. The room filled with Karen's own voice from a recorded phone call. "If Jackson won't comply, we'll bury him in fines until he has no choice but to sell." Gasps. Pure, stunned silence. "Then, you manipulative witch, you set us up." "I'm calling my lawyer." Karen turned and bolted for the door, pushing past angry residents. She had lost, completely, utterly lost. I stepped outside, breathing in the cool evening air. One battle was won, but the war? That was just getting started. I barely had time to enjoy the fallout before the first threat came in. Karen was cornered, humiliated, and losing control of the monster she had created, but she wasn't going down without a fight. I had expected her to retreat, to lick her wounds and hope the HOA board could salvage what was left of their little empire. But Karen? Karen doubled down. The next morning, I woke up to an email from her lawyer. "Dear Mr. Jackson, our client, Miss Karen Wilson, has informed us of your illegal attempts to intimidate and coerce the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. You have threatened to shut off the water supply to hundreds of families as an act of retaliation. This is unacceptable and could result in both civil and criminal liability. Effective immediately, we are filing for an emergency injunction to prevent you from manipulating the water rights. In addition, we demand you publicly retract your false accusations regarding the land sale and cease all harassment of Miss Wilson and the HOA board. Failure to comply will result in swift legal action. Sincerely, Preston and Landry, attorneys at law." I read the email 3 times, my rage simmering hotter with each pass. Harassment? Intimidation? Karen had the audacity to act like the victim after she had stolen my land. I pushed away from the kitchen table and grabbed my phone. Sam. I growled the second my lawyer picked up. You see this? I saw it, he sighed. She's desperate. But don't underestimate her. If they get an injunction before we can file our own claims, it'll be a mess. I ran a hand through my hair. What do we do? We hit first. I'm heading to the courthouse now to file our own motion to contest the land sale. I'll also request a hearing on the fraud charges. But you, he hesitated. You need to be careful. Karen's backed into a corner, and that makes her dangerous. Dangerous. The thought would have made me laugh if this weren't so serious. Karen wasn't dangerous, she was a spoiled bully who had finally gotten caught. But as the day unfolded, I realized just how far she was willing to go. By noon, the sheriff showed up at my doorstep. Got a complaint filed against you, Mike, Sheriff Davis said, looking tired. HOA claims you tampered with the water supply, deliberately reducing flow to the community. I blinked. Are you kidding me? He handed me the paperwork. They want an official investigation. I scoffed, crossing my arms. And what's the evidence? A feeling? A hunch? Because last I checked, my irrigation was working just fine. Davis sighed. I know, Mike. But the HOA is claiming their water pressure dropped this morning. And since you announced your plans last night, well, you see where this is going. I clenched my jaw. I haven't touched the damn water supply. But you and I both know Karen's got friends in high places. So what now? I have to check it out, he admitted. But off the record, I think this is a stunt. A setup. I exhaled slowly. Fine. Let's check it out. We drove out to the main control junction, the one on my land, and sure enough, nothing had changed. The pipes were intact, pressure levels were normal, and not a single valve had been adjusted. I gestured around. See? Everything's as it should be. Davis nodded. Yeah, but I still have to file a report. I ran a hand down my face. So what now? He hesitated. Now? You brace yourself, Mike. Karen isn't done yet. That night, my farm was vandalized. I heard the truck engines first. Multiple vehicles tearing down my dirt road like they had somewhere to be. By the time I grabbed my shotgun and stepped onto the porch, the headlights had cut out. Then came the sound of metal scraping against wood. I sprinted toward the barn, heart pounding. When I got there, my stomach dropped. The storage tanks, the ones holding fuel for my tractors, had been slashed open, diesel spilling out into the dirt. Nearby, my fencing had been cut, and several of my irrigation lines lay in ruins. A single spray-painted message stretched across the barn door. Farmers, D-O-N-T, belong here. Rage boiled up so fast I could barely see straight. I scanned the property, but the cowards were already gone. Tires' tracks cut through the mud, leading back toward the main road. I took a shaky breath, trying to rein in my fury. This was an attack. Not a legal battle, not a dispute. An attack on my home. My phone buzzed. A text from Tom, my cousin. Karen's HOA crew is celebrating at Ridgewood Grill. They think you'll fold. Fold? Not a chance. I pulled into Ridgewood Grill 15 minutes later. The restaurant was buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the unmistakable sound of Karen's obnoxious voice carrying over the crowd. I stepped inside, scanning the room, and there she was, sipping wine, laughing, surrounded by her cronies like she hadn't just sent a group of thugs to destroy my property. I walked straight up to their table. The laughter died instantly. Karen smirked. Mr. Jackson, to what do we owe the pleasure? I leaned in, resting my hands on the table. Hope you enjoyed your little stunt. She feigned innocence. I have no idea what you're talking about. I smiled. It wasn't friendly. Oh, you will, because I just finished filing a police report for felony property damage. And tomorrow, I'll be making sure every single business in town knows exactly who's responsible. Karen's smirk faltered. You have no proof. I leaned in further. I have security cameras. Silence. Then, pure, unmistakable panic in her eyes. I turned to leave, but not before giving her one last parting gift. Enjoy your wine, Karen. It might be the last drink you have as HOA president. I walked out feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Karen wanted war. She just got one. The next morning, I was up before the sun, pacing my front porch with a cup of coffee in one hand and my phone in the other. I didn't sleep much after my confrontation with Karen at the Ridgewood Grill. I was too wired, too damn angry. She thought she could scare me off. Thought she could vandalize my farm, throw some legal threats my way, and I'd just roll over. She had no idea who she was dealing with. My security footage had captured everything: the trucks rolling in, the men slashing my fuel tanks, the fence being cut. They weren't even smart enough to wear masks. And the best part? One of them had been dumb enough to drive his own vehicle, a shiny white pickup, with a personalized license plate. I had spent half the night running the plate through every contact I had in town. And sure enough, it belonged to Richard Thompson, HOA treasurer. By 8 a.m., I was parked outside the sheriff's office, a USB drive clutched in my hand. Sheriff Davis was just unlocking the door when he saw me storming up the steps. "Mike," I shoved the drive into his hand. "That's footage of HOA members trespassing on my land and committing felony property damage. And before you say anything, I expect arrests." Davis sighed, rubbing his temples. "Jesus, Mike, you really weren't kidding when you said this was going to get messy." "Messy? This isn't messy, Dave. This is criminal." He exhaled sharply, then nodded. "All right, I'll take a look." "No," I said. "You'll do more than that. You'll arrest them. If it were me tearing up someone's front lawn in Oak Ridge Estates, you and I both know I'd already be in cuffs." Davis met my eyes, then gave a single nod. "Give me a few hours." I didn't thank him. This was his damn job. 3 hours later, I was back on my land, fixing the damage they had done, when I heard the sirens. I wiped my hands on my jeans and turned toward the road just in time to see 2 squad cars pulling up to Karen's house. I leaned against my fence, arms crossed, and watched as the deputies knocked on her door. It took a full minute before she opened it, stepping out in her designer blouse and stiff posture, probably expecting to talk her way out of whatever minor inconvenience had dared show up on her doorstep. Then she saw the cuffs. Karen's entire body went rigid as the deputy read the charges: trespassing, vandalism, destruction of private property. But the real fun came when they slapped cuffs on Richard Thompson, who looked about ready to piss himself. I could almost hear Karen screeching from across the street. "This is outrageous. I am the president of the HOA. You can't do this. I have connections." The deputies didn't care. They hauled her and Richard to the squad cars, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the windows of her pristine 2-story home. Neighbors peeked through curtains. A few even stepped outside, watching as their almighty HOA president was loaded into the back of a police vehicle like a common criminal. "You'll regret this," Karen screamed as they shut the door. "Jackson, this isn't over." I took a sip of my coffee, enjoying the show. Oh, it was definitely over. For her. By the time news of Karen's arrest hit the town, the HOA was already falling apart. Members who once stood by her side were now scrambling to distance themselves. No one wanted to be associated with a leader who had been arrested for felonies. Emergency meetings were called, votes were held, and by the end of the day, Karen Wilson was officially removed as HOA president. I would have cracked open a beer right then and there if I wasn't so damn busy. The fight wasn't over yet, because while Karen might have been knocked off her throne, the land deal was still in place. The developers were still planning to break ground. Westview Development still thought they owned my farm, which meant I had one more battle left to win. The next morning, I walked straight into the Westview Development office downtown, slamming a thick file onto the receptionist's desk. "Tell your boss to read that." The receptionist blinked, looking flustered. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" "I don't need one. I have proof their purchase was fraudulent." That got her attention. She hurried into the back office. Minutes later, a man in a tailored suit walked out, looking irritated. "Mr. Jackson, I'm James Miller, head of acquisitions. I understand you have concerns about the land transfer." I smiled coldly. "Oh, I don't have concerns, Miller. I have proof your company was sold stolen land, and if you don't want to be tied up in fraud investigations for the next 5 years, you'll return my property today." Miller hesitated, then opened the file. Inside were copies of the forged documents, records of HOA bribes, and the county's official fraud investigation. His face paled as he flipped through it. This is serious." "Damn right it is. And if you don't void the sale, your company will be dragged into a legal battle that'll make your investors run for the hills." Miller exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Give me 24 hours. Less than a day later, the official statement went out. Westview Development was terminating its agreement with Oak Ridge Estates HOA. The land was being returned to its rightful owner. Me. I read the statement 3 times, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Then I sat back, exhaling a breath I felt like I had been holding for months. It was over. Really finally over. Karen had lost. The HOA had collapsed. The developers had backed off. And my farm? My family's legacy? It was mine again. As I stepped onto my porch that evening, looking out over the land my grandfather had built from nothing, I let the moment sink in. Karen had tried to take everything from me, and now she had nothing. I smiled, letting the satisfaction wash over me. Some people never learn. The battle was won, but the war had one last chapter. Karen was gone. The HOA had crumbled. Westview had tucked its tail and scurried back to the city. And yet, I still felt something gnawing at my gut, a feeling that this wasn't quite over, and I was right. Because 2 days after Westview officially voided the fraudulent sale and returned my land, I saw her, Karen Wilson, standing at the edge of my property, just beyond the tree line, watching. I was on my porch when I spotted her. She wasn't in her usual pantsuit this time. No, this Karen looked disheveled, her hair unbrushed, her designer blouse wrinkled like she'd been sleeping in it. Her arms were crossed, nails digging into her skin, as she stared at my land like she still owned it, like she still had a plan. I stood, coffee cup in hand, and locked eyes with her. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. Just stood there, a storm brewing behind her fake, manicured exterior. I set my coffee down. If she thought I was going to be intimidated after everything she had pulled, she had another thing coming. I walked straight toward her, boots crunching against the dry grass. I didn't stop until I was close enough to see the pure hatred behind her plastic smile. "You're trespassing, Karen." My voice was calm, deadly. Again, she inhaled sharply through her nose, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "I'm just admiring the view, Mr. Jackson. You know, it's such a shame." I raised a brow. "What is?" Her eyes flickered toward the fields behind me. My fields, the land she had tried to steal. "That you're keeping all of this to yourself." Her voice was syrupy sweet, but there was venom underneath. "You could have done something great, built something better. Instead, you're just." She gestured vaguely at my farm, wasting potential. I chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "You mean I could have paved over 4 generations of farmland to build a strip mall and overpriced condos?" Her smile twitched. "Progress, Mr. Jackson." It was going to be progress. I let the silence stretch, watching her squirm. Then I took a deliberate step forward, making sure she understood exactly whose land she was standing on. "You lost, Karen. You lost everything." My voice was steady, but I didn't bother hiding the satisfaction. No HOA, no power, no stolen land deals. You don't even have your precious little connections anymore. And now, you're just another bitter ex-president with nothing left to do but sulk. For the first time, her mask cracked, her nostrils flared, her carefully sculpted composure slipping just enough for me to see the raw desperation underneath. "This isn't over," she whispered. I smirked. "Oh, it is. And I'd suggest you get used to it. Because the next time you set foot on my land, you won't just be looking at a criminal trespassing charge, you'll be looking at me pressing every damn charge I can throw at you." I took another step. Karen stepped back. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being the one who had to retreat. She turned sharply on her heel, stalking back toward the road. But just before she stepped onto the pavement, she paused. Then, without looking back, she said something that almost made me laugh. "You don't deserve this land." I crossed my arms. "And you don't deserve a damn thing." She flinched, just slightly, before shoving her sunglasses on and marching back toward the neighborhood that no longer worshipped her. As I watched her go, I felt something settle in my chest. A finality. Karen Wilson was finished. Life didn't return to normal right away. There was too much to clean up. I spent the next few weeks undoing the damage Karen and her cronies had caused. I rebuilt my fences, repaired the irrigation lines, and cleaned up the mess they had made of my farm. Meanwhile, the HOA. It was a complete disaster. With Karen gone and half the board either resigning or facing fraud charges, the community turned against what was left of it. Emergency meetings were held, votes were cast, and within a month, Oak Ridge Estates HOA was officially dissolved. The residents, many of whom had once blindly followed Karen, decided they didn't need an HOA at all. They kicked out the board, rewrote their neighborhood agreements, and decided to handle things as an actual community. No more ridiculous fines. No more power-hungry Karens. Just neighbors being neighbors. And as for me, I had my land back. All of it. The sun was setting as I sat on my porch, beer in hand, watching the golden light wash over my fields. It was quiet, peaceful, exactly how it should be. Then, my phone buzzed. A text from my cousin Tom. Karen sold her house. Moved out this morning. Thought you'd want to know. I stared at the message for a long moment before taking a slow sip of my beer. Karen Wilson was gone. For good. A slow smile spread across my face. Good riddance. I set my beer down, stretched out in my chair, and let out a breath I'd been holding for far too long. The war was over. And this time, I had won. I should have known better than to think Karen Wilson would slink off, quietly into the night. It had been 3 months since she left Oak Ridge Estates, her name now a whispered curse among the homeowners she once ruled over. The HOA was dead, my land was mine again, and life had finally settled back into the rhythm it was supposed to have. Or so I thought, because Karen wasn't finished. I found out the hard way when I opened my mailbox one crisp fall morning and found a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. Frowning, one tore it open right there on my porch. The words slammed into me like a gut punch. Notice of civil litigation. Plaintiff, Karen Wilson. Defendant, Michael Jackson's case summary. The plaintiff alleges that the defendant engaged in defamatory, malicious, and slanderous actions that resulted in personal, financial, and reputational harm. The plaintiff seeks damages in the amount of $3,500,000. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Karen was suing me for $3.5 million. I read the letter again, just to make sure my sleep-deprived brain wasn't playing tricks on me. But no, there it was in black and white. Karen was claiming that my actions, calling her out in public, exposing her corruption, getting her arrested, had ruined her life. Like she needed my help to do that. I took a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the paper. So, this was her last move. She couldn't take my land, couldn't control the HOA, couldn't even show her face in town without people muttering under their breath, but she could still try to drain me dry. I wasn't going to let that happen. The moment I walked into Sam Grayson's office, my lawyer took one look at my face and sighed. "Let me guess," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "She's back." I dropped the letter onto his desk. "You tell me." Sam picked it up, scanned it, and let out a long, slow whistle. "Jesus, she really is desperate. Can she win?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. He snorted. "Not a chance." "But that's not the point, Mike. She's not trying to win. She's trying to bleed you out. This is a classic slap-suit strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's designed to drag you through the legal system, cost you a fortune, and make you wish you'd never messed with her." I clenched my jaw. "So how do we stop it?" Sam leaned back in his chair, already flipping through his mental legal arsenal. "Lucky for you, slap suits are illegal in this state. We'll file a motion to dismiss under anti-slap statutes. If we win, not only does the case get thrown out, but she'll be forced to pay your legal fees." A slow grin spread across my face. "So, she wants to bankrupt me, but instead she might end up bankrupting herself?" "Exactly." I let out a low chuckle. "File the motion. Let's end this for good." 2 weeks later, I found myself back in court, but this time, I wasn't the one fighting to save my home. Karen sat across the aisle, dressed in a cheap, off-the-rack blazer that screamed. I'm trying to look like a serious litigant. Her once perfect hair was dull, her nails unpolished, her expression a twisted mix of smugness and barely concealed desperation. She thought she had me. She thought I'd crumble under the weight of the lawsuit, too exhausted to keep fighting. She had no idea I had come prepared to bury her. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman who had no patience for nonsense, listened as Karen's lawyer droned on about my reckless slander and malicious intent. Then she turned to Sam. "Mr. Grayson, your response." Sam stood, buttoned his jacket, and tore her case apart. "Your Honor, this lawsuit is nothing more than an attempt to silence my client for exposing the truth about Miss Wilson's criminal actions. The charges against her were real. The fraud was real. The vandalism, the trespassing, the illegal land deal, all of it was real. And we have the court records, the police reports, and the news articles to prove it." The judge turned to Karen's lawyer. "How exactly does one defame someone by reporting facts?" Karen stiffened. Her lawyer fumbled. Well, Your Honor, the emotional and social impact on my client has been devastating. Her reputation was ruined by her own actions. The judge interrupted. She flipped through the documents in front of her, then leveled her gaze at Karen. Miss Wilson, this lawsuit is nothing more than a blatant attempt at retaliation. I am dismissing it with prejudice. Furthermore, under the state's anti-SLAPP statutes, you are ordered to cover all of Mr. Jackson's legal fees. Karen's mouth fell open. What? No, you can't, I can, the judge said flatly. And I have. This case is over. I sat back in my chair, savoring the moment. Karen, once the untouchable queen of Oak Ridge Estates, was now a broken, humiliated mess. A woman who had lost everything and still refused to accept it was her own damn fault. And now, she was going to pay me. As the bailiff escorted her out, she turned and shot me one final glare, eyes burning with the kind of hatred that only comes from complete and utter defeat. I gave her a slow, mocking smile and mouthed 2 words, "Goodbye, Karen." And just like that, she was gone. For real this time. A month later, a check arrived in the mail. It wasn't much, just enough to cover my legal fees, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Karen Wilson had been forced to write me a check. I framed the damn thing. Not because I needed a reminder of what I'd won, but because it was proof that some battles, some fights against entitlement, greed, and corruption, they're worth every second.